Welcome to the 73rd reading of my memoir, The Innocence of Guilt. Visits and Stresses. We received a visit from a Baptist minister who had been given our names by Reverend Bailey. As we allowed him to enter our home, an embarrassment came over us, knowing we hadn't attended a regular church service since we became man and wife. We didn't tell this to the minister, though, and agreed to go to his church on Sunday morning. "I suppose we have to get it out of the way. It won't hurt us," Brian said after he'd gone. A comfort came over me as I stood in a pew a few days later, singing familiar hymns from a familiar hymn book. After the service, we congregated in the foyer with a crowd of youngsters who obviously thought we were in their age category. They enthusiastically invited us to a youth group outing, but they had no inkling we were 28 years old, and also failed to notice we were parents of a little girl. We left before being consumed by religious fervour of a serious nature. At least that's how Brian explained our need for such a hasty departure. I had been disappointed that no one of our age group approached us, although Brian said it wouldn't have made any difference. He had no intention of taking us back there. He said how boring it had all been. Out of the habit of expressing deep emotional or spiritual stirrings, I let the subject drop. 3 months later, snow all gone and spring revealing little glimpses of the summer to come, we moved to a ground floor apartment so Karen could have a sandbox and a small back garden to play in. As the weather warmed up, residents moved the coffee meetings into the grass courtyard. Women took turns making coffee and providing the cookies and cakes. Children played on the swings while we chatted. I'd wanted company when living in Chelsea, but this was overload. Sometimes I didn't answer the door so as to avoid the intrusion into my private life, the apartment complex being a hotbed of gossip. Still, I did make friends. We watched each other's children, folded up each other's laundry, and life was never dull. At Christmas time, Brian and I threw a wine and cheese party for the office crowd. We set up an artificial tree and put candles all over the apartment. Guests arrived with their own contributions of wine and snacks. Halfway through the evening, I fell ill and wanted them to leave. The noise and heat of all those people overwhelmed me. I couldn't eat a thing, and I never wanted to throw another party again. Brian had been kept mainly in the office up until now, except for short local trips, but that soon changed. His first overseas consulting trip sent him to Australia for 2 months. I handled it well during the day, with Karen to care for and all the activity of the complex, but at night, alone, watching television, I became nervous. My heart thumped in my chest, and I imagined I was having a heart attack. After a few nights of this, I saw my doctor, who assured me a woman of my age did not usually fall prey to heart attacks. He diagnosed me with anxiety. Proof of my stress became crystal clear when I reacted strongly to Karen one day and reined myself in for fear of abusing her. I'd never taken out my frustration on her before. Deeply ashamed, I realized I was no better than my father by the way I berated her for some inconsequential thing. I lifted her up onto the kitchen countertop and in tears apologized profusely to her. Karen endured her own little crisis over her daddy being away. Even though he sent her postcards from the other side of the world, she sadly asked a question on several occasions that sounded more like a statement. "Daddy's never coming home, is he?" He returned, however, bringing us both a toy koala bear and fascinating stories of his time working in the Australian bush. From then on, we had to accept he would leave us for weeks at a time, the nature of his job. In July 1972, we happily moved into our first house, 307 4001 The Maples, a Design Award condominium in a complex on Mount Seymour Parkway, within walking distance of beautiful Deep Cove on the North Shore, the last undeveloped part of Vancouver. The complex boasted a heated outdoor pool and a golf course surrounded it on 2 sides. Thrilled to own such a beautiful house, I couldn't wait to show Mum how we now lived. She agreed to fly over at our expense for a 2-week holiday in August. She hadn't seen Karen except in photos for a year and a half. Her bubbly 3-year-old granddaughter took to her as if she'd never been parted from her nana. The holiday with Mum proved a success, primarily because Brian drove us around to show off Vancouver and all its sights, including a trip to Mount Baker across the American border. Mum marveled that she could stand in front of a huge snow-covered mountainside and throw snowballs at us in the middle of August. The comparative peace, as opposed to the last time we were together, was mostly due to Brian's art of listening to Mum go on and on about her domestic trials back home in England, stories he'd heard 1,000,000 times before, and not let on that it irritated him to the point of extreme frustration. I instinctively drew away from her at those times. The 2 weeks flew by, and she was back in England before we knew it, but with something exciting to go back to. David married a few months after our departure, and Julie gave birth to a baby girl in August. They named her Charlotte, and Mum could hardly wait to see her. David and Julie lived in Colchester, so although Mum now occupied Wickham Road all by herself, she had them close by. Charlotte helped heal the wound created by the absence of little Karen. Brian expressed his desire for us to have another baby, and although I hadn't said I wasn't interested, I hadn't shown a lot of enthusiasm either. Content with my little girl, I poured all my energy into her. With Brian away so often, Karen became my world. I never tired of introducing her to new things. I encouraged her creativity and art, and I taught her to sew. She could make all her own dolly clothes, and we spent endless hours together working on different projects. She was so precocious and adorable, and I honestly didn't know if I would be able to care for another child and still do all the things I enjoyed doing with her. Still, Brian said it would be great if we could try for a little boy, so I gave in. June of 1973, we expected our new arrival. I sat Karen down and told her about the coming baby. "I want a baby sister," she said firmly, as if a baby was a doll you bought at a store. Several times she mentioned her little sister, and I grew unsettled as Brian had his heart set on a boy. How can I possibly please the pair of them, each one hoping for the opposite gender? The only way would be to give birth to twins, a boy and a girl, but I didn't hold out much hope for that. As time went on, though, I did wonder if I might be carrying twins because of the size I became. My doctor said he could only hear one heartbeat, but that had been the case with Brian's mum, too. Brian had been a total surprise. Ultrasounds weren't routine for pregnancies in the 1970s, so I had to wait and see. My doctor changed his mind on my due date. He now gave it as April. I knew when I'd conceived, but he insisted he knew best. This posed a dilemma for Brian. His 2-month trip to Zambia meant he wouldn't return until the middle of May. I couldn't be left on my own with nobody to leave Karen with when I went into the hospital. He spoke to his boss, and the company agreed to pay Mum's airfare if she would come over. Mum had no choice in the matter because I had nobody else to ask, so she reluctantly agreed to come for 3 months, to cover all the bases, so to speak. We picked her up from Vancouver Airport around mid-March. By her attitude, we knew she felt coerced into doing us a huge favour, unlike the pleasant trip of last year. After Brian took off for Zambia a few days later, she and I found ourselves living in the same irritating, awkward, tension-filled atmosphere present before I left for Canada. This time she lived in my house under my rules. The first night without Brian, we had a huge row, and I went to bed in tears, wondering how on earth I would survive the next 2 months of emotional hell without Brian's support. She had left her little dog at a boarding kennel, paid for by Brian's company, and constantly worried out loud how he must be pining for her and what it might do to him. I tried to reassure her he would be all right, but she snapped at me and told me I didn't know anything about dogs. "It's all very well for you to say he'll be all right," she snarled. "He's never been apart from me before." No useful counterattack for that, but I knew that if not for me and my nuisance of a pregnancy, she'd still be in Colchester with her little dog. I didn't need my mother there, not then. I don't know what sense of my helplessness Brian conveyed to her when he urged her to come, but I found it irritating having her trail after me all day long, as if checking on her small child. She had brought no books or knitting or anything to amuse herself with. She resembled a northern cool weather plant transplanted into a tropical climate, out of its natural habitat and fighting against the strangeness of it. Towards the end of the first month of her stay, my blood pressure elevated, so I needed to rest every afternoon. I couldn't do that without Mum taking Karen out. By then the temperature had risen uncomfortably, and Mum didn't like the heat any more than I did. She reluctantly took Karen to the sandbox in the complex, and I took to my bed. I didn't sleep, but enjoyed the brief respite from Mum, if you can call lying in bed, fuming about her irritating habits, a respite. I'm sure it didn't do my blood pressure any good. Things would have been so much easier if I'd learnt to drive. The Toyota, our ticket to farther vistas than limited walking excursions achieved, sat in the carport all day long, reminding us both how trapped we were. Mum and I would settle down to watch a little television, but around 9 o'clock I'd start to fall asleep and saw no purpose in staying up. "Do you have to go to bed, dear?" she'd ask. "Yes, Mum, I'm afraid I do," I'd reply. Up the stairs I went with a strong sense of guilt that I'd left her to sit all by herself, alone again, naturally, as the title of Gilbert O'Sullivan's song declared. She loved that song. I didn't, because it reminded me of her lonely life, a life I perpetually felt responsible for, yet was powerless to change. Thank you for listening. Please feel free to subscribe, like, or comment on this reading, and hopefully you will tune in to the next one. Bye for now.